The gunshot that killed Nora Easton's husband wasn't meant for him. But that didn't make the grave any less permanent, or the Texas dust any less red where his blood had soaked into it. She stood at the edge of the modest ranch, 3 miles outside San Antonio in the summer of 1876, staring at the land that had been theirs for only 8 months before a stray bullet from a drunken brawl in town had made it hers alone. The other women from the church had brought casseroles and pitying looks, their pretty faces painted with rehearsed sympathy, and Nora had watched them whisper to each other about how tragic it was that such a plain woman should now be left alone without even beauty to help her catch another husband. She heard their words through the thin walls of her home during the reception after the funeral. Margaret Chen, the banker's daughter with her porcelain skin and rosebud mouth, had said it clearest. Poor thing. She wasn't much to look at before, and grief certainly hasn't improved her situation. A woman alone needs something to recommend her, and Nora has always been so unfortunately plain. Nora had looked at herself in the mirror that night after everyone left. Her face was long and angular, her nose prominent, her mouth wide. Her hair was the color of mud after rain, neither brown nor blonde, just existing without distinction. Her eyes were green but not the striking emerald that poets wrote about, just a pale watery green like pond algae. Her frame was tall and solid, built for work rather than delicate femininity. She had never been called pretty, not even as a child. Her mother had called her sturdy. Her father had called her capable. Her late husband had called her practical. The ranch needed selling. She knew that. A woman alone couldn't manage 200 acres and 30 head of cattle. But the thought of returning to town, of living in a boarding house, or taking in sewing while those pretty women passed her on the street with their pitying smiles, made something hard and defiant crystallize in her chest. She decided to drive the cattle to market herself. It was a stupid decision, dangerous and probably doomed to failure, but it was hers. She spent 2 weeks preparing, trading her dresses for men's working clothes that fit her tall frame better anyway, practicing with her husband's rifle until she could hit a target at 30 yards, and studying the maps he had left behind. The route to Ash Fork, Arizona, where the railroad had recently established a shipping station, would take her through some of the most unforgiving territory in the West, but the prices there were twice what she could get in San Antonio. On the morning she planned to leave, the young ranch hand who had been helping her husband appeared at dawn. Tommy was barely 19, with soft hands and softer ambitions. He took one look at her preparations and shook his head. "Madam, I can't go with you. My mother would never forgive me, and besides, everyone in town is saying this is madness. You should sell to Mr. Patterson like he offered. It's a fair price." "It's half what the cattle are worth, and you know it," Nora said, cinching her saddle tighter. "Go on home, Tommy, I'll manage." He left, and she was glad. She didn't need witnesses to her potential failure. The first week of the drive went better than she had any right to expect. The cattle were accustomed to moving between pastures, and her husband had trained his horse, a steady bay gelding named Rust, well enough that the animal seemed to understand the work without much guidance. She followed the established trails west, staying away from towns where a woman driving cattle alone would attract the wrong kind of attention. The loneliness was vast and complete. At night, she made small fires and ate salt pork and beans, listening to the cattle settle and the coyotes sing. She had brought her husband's journal, and she read his notes about the stars and the land by firelight. He had been a quiet man, not ungenerous, but not particularly warm either. Theirs had been a marriage of convenience. She had needed security after her parents died. He had needed someone to cook and mend. Neither had pretended it was a love match. On the 8th day, she crossed into New Mexico territory. The land grew more austere, the vegetation sparse and hostile. The cattle grew restless with the heat, and she had to push them harder toward water sources. Her face burned bronze under the relentless sun, and her hands developed calluses on top of calluses. It was on the 10th day that she lost control of the herd. A rattlesnake spooked one of the lead steers, and suddenly 30 head of cattle were scattering across the desert scrub in a dozen different directions. Nora rode hard, trying to turn them back, but Rust stumbled in a gopher hole and went down hard. She hit the ground and rolled, the breath knocked from her lungs. By the time she got to her feet, the horse was favoring his right foreleg, and the cattle were vanishing into the heat shimmer on the horizon. She stood there in the middle of nowhere, her horse lame, her cattle gone, and the full weight of her foolishness crashed down on her. She had been so determined to prove she wasn't helpless, so stubborn in her refusal to accept pity or charity, that she had ridden straight into disaster. Margaret Chen had been right. She wasn't pretty enough or smart enough or capable enough. She was just a plain, stupid woman who was going to die in the desert because she couldn't accept her own limitations. She checked Rust's leg. Not broken, thank God, but badly strained. He wouldn't be carrying her anywhere for days. She had water for maybe 3 days if she was careful. The nearest town, according to her map, was at least 20 miles north. Nora unsaddled Rust and hobbled him near a patch of scrub grass, then sat down in the minimal shade of a Joshua tree to think. She wouldn't cry. Crying was useless. She needed a plan. The sound of hoofbeats brought her head up an hour later. A single rider approached from the west, moving with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this harsh landscape. As he drew closer, she could make out details. Tall in the saddle, wearing a battered hat pulled low against the sun, with a bandana covering the lower half of his face against the dust. He rode a paint horse with the muscular build of an animal bred for endurance. Nora stood, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle propped against the tree. Out here, alone, she couldn't afford to trust anyone. The rider stopped about 10 yards away and slowly pulled the bandana down. The face beneath was sun-darkened and lean, with lines around the eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against bright horizons. His eyes were a startling blue, unexpected and direct. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe 30 at most. "You seem to be in some difficulty, madam," he said. His voice was low and rough like gravel in a creek bed. "My cattle scattered. My horse is lame." "But I'm managing," Nora said, lifting her chin. Those blue eyes studied her for a long moment, then scanned the horizon where dust still hung in the air from the departed herd. "Managing," he repeated, and there wasn't any mockery in his tone, just a kind of thoughtful assessment. "You driving alone?" "I am. From where to where?" "San Antonio to Ash Fork." He whistled low. "That's ambitious for a lone rider, ambitious and dangerous." "I'm aware of both facts, thank you. You make a habit of pointing out the obvious to strangers." Something flickered in his expression. It might have been amusement. "Sometimes. Depends on the stranger. Name's Owen Dalton. I've got a small spread about 15 miles north of here. I was tracking a missing mare when I saw the dust from your stampede. Nora Easton." She didn't offer her hand. "I don't need rescuing, Mr. Dalton. I'll recover my cattle and be on my way." "On a lame horse. In this heat. Your cattle are scattered across 20 square miles by now, and you've got maybe 3 days of water in those canteens." "Then I'd better get started," Nora said. Owen Dalton dismounted slowly, giving her time to object. When she didn't raise the rifle, he walked over to Rust and examined the horse's leg with practiced hands. The gelding allowed the inspection calmly. "He needs at least a week of rest, maybe 2. You push him now, you'll ruin him permanently." I don't have 2 weeks. No, you don't. He straightened and looked at her again with that same direct gaze. Here's what I propose. My spread has good grazing and water. You come back with me, let your horse heal, and I'll help you round up your cattle. Once your herd is gathered and your horse is sound, I'll help you drive them to Ash Fork. Why? Nora asked bluntly. What do you want in return? Nothing you're worried about, he said, reading her correctly. Truth is, I could use the company for the drive. I've got 15 head I need to take to market myself. Easier and safer to move them together. We'll split the trail costs. It was a reasonable offer. Too reasonable, which made her suspicious. But the alternative was struggling alone, probably losing everything, maybe dying. Pride was expensive and she had already paid too much for it. All right, she said, but I pay my own way. I'm not accepting charity. Wouldn't dream of offering it, Owen said. You look like you'd shoot me if I tried. I would. Good to know where we stand. They rigged a lead for Rust, and Nora rode double behind Owen on his paint horse. It should have been awkward sitting that close to a strange man, her arms around his waist to keep her seat. But he didn't make it strange. He just rode, pointing out landmarks and explaining the territory in that rough, steady voice. His ranch, when they reached it near sunset, was modest but well-maintained. A small cabin with a covered porch, a sturdy barn, corrals that had been recently repaired, and a windmill pulling water into a tank. Everything spoke of hard work and careful attention. You live alone? Nora asked as she slid down from the horse. I do. Had a partner for a few years, but he decided to try his luck in California last spring. Haven't found anyone I trust enough to replace him yet. He led the paint toward the barn. There's a spare room in the cabin. It's clean. You can have it while you're here. The cabin was sparse but organized. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and shelves neatly stacked with supplies. 2 doors led off the main room. Owen pointed to the left one. That's yours. I'm on the right. There's a wash basin out back and soap if you want to clean up. I'll see to the horses and then start something for dinner. Nora carried her saddlebags into the small room. It held a narrow bed with clean blankets, a trunk, and a single window with actual glass in it. Luxury in this country. She sat on the bed and felt the full weight of the day settle on her. She had been so close to complete disaster. Part of her wanted to curl up and let the fear shake through her. But that was weakness, and she had learned long ago that plain women couldn't afford weakness. She washed her face and hands in the basin behind the cabin, scrubbing away layers of dust. Her reflection in the small mirror nailed to the barn wall showed exactly what she expected. Sun-reddened skin, hair escaping from its braid in wild tangles, shadows under her eyes. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman in over her head, surviving on stubbornness alone. When she came back inside, Owen was at the stove frying salt pork and heating beans. He had removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that needed cutting. He moved around the small kitchen area with easy efficiency. Coffee's hot, he said without turning around. She poured herself a cup and sat at the table. The silence between them was surprisingly comfortable. He served up 2 plates and sat across from her. They ate without talking much. The food was simple but good, and Nora realized she hadn't eaten since dawn. Thank you, she said finally. For helping, for this, Owen shrugged. Out here we help each other or we die. That's not charity, that's just sense. Still, most men would have either left me there or demanded something improper in return for their help. Then you've been meeting the wrong kind of men, maybe. She studied him across the table. You always this straightforward, usually. Life's too short for games and words are too easy to waste. He met her gaze steadily. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Easton. You're in a difficult spot and we both know it. But I've seen plenty of men fail at what you're attempting, and you've gotten farther than most would have. That takes grit. I respect grit. Even in a woman, especially in a woman. World tries harder to beat it out of you. Something in her chest loosened slightly. She had been braced for condescension or unwanted advances, the two responses she had learned to expect from men. This simple respect was unexpected and oddly moving. "Your husband teach you to shoot?" Owen asked. "I taught myself after he died. He never thought I needed to know." "But you did." "I did." Owen nodded slowly. "Tomorrow we'll start gathering your cattle. It'll take a few days. You up for hard riding? I'm up for whatever it takes." That's what I figured. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Nora listened to the sounds of the ranch settling. She heard Owen moving around in his room, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of movement. It was strange having another person so close after weeks of solitude. Strange, but not unpleasant. She thought about how he had looked at her, not with pity or desire or dismissal. Just straightforward assessment, human to human. When was the last time someone had looked at her that way? Her husband certainly never had. He had looked at her like inventory, useful but unremarkable. Sleep came slowly, pulled down by exhaustion stronger than her restless thoughts. The next morning, Owen woke her before dawn. They ate a quick breakfast of coffee and cornbread, then rode out as the sun painted the eastern sky orange and gold. Owen's paint horse, whose name was Dakota, moved with tireless strength, and Owen rode with the relaxed posture of someone utterly at home in the saddle. "Your cattle will be looking for water," he explained as they rode. "There are 3 main sources in this area. We'll check each one systematically." The work was exactly as hard as Nora had expected. They found the first group of cattle at a small spring around midday, 7 head that had grouped back together instinctively. Owen showed her how to move them slowly, working with their herd instinct rather than against it. His patience was instructive. He never hurried, never shouted, just positioned himself correctly and let the cattle make the choice he wanted them to make. By sunset, they had recovered 12 head and driven them back to Owen's ranch to secure them in his larger corral. Nora was exhausted, every muscle aching, but it was the good exhaustion of real work. Owen made dinner again while she tended to Dakota, brushing the horse down as she had seen him do. "You're good with horses," Owen said when she came inside. "I like them better than most people, smart woman." They fell into a pattern over the next 4 days. Rise before dawn, ride out, search for cattle, return at dusk. Owen was an easy companion on the trail. He didn't talk unless he had something worth saying, and he seemed content with silence. When he did speak, it was usually to point out something about the land or share some piece of practical wisdom about handling livestock. By the 4th evening, they had recovered 26 of her 30 cattle. The other 4 were probably dead or too far scattered to find, but 26 was enough to make the drive worthwhile. Nora calculated the numbers in her head. Even accounting for costs, she would have enough to keep the ranch for another year, maybe 2 if she was careful. That night, as they sat on the porch after dinner watching the stars emerge, Owen finally asked the question she had been expecting. "Why are you doing this alone? The drive, I mean." "You must have had options back in San Antonio." "I had offers," Nora said. "Men willing to buy me out for a fraction of what it's worth. Other men willing to marry me for the land. None of them saw me. They just saw a problem to solve or property to acquire. So you decided to solve it yourself." "I decided I was done being something that happened to other people. I wanted to do something that was mine, even if I failed." Owen was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to fail. You've already succeeded at the hard part." "What's that?" Keeping going when everything said to quit. Nora looked at him in the starlight. His profile was sharp against the sky, and there was something solid about him, something steadfast. She had been careful not to let herself think of him as anything but a temporary ally, a means to an end. But sitting here in the peaceful darkness, she felt something shift. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. Why did you really help me? The truth." Owen was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "My mother drove cattle alone after my father died. I was too young to help much. She made it 50 miles before raiders caught up to her. They took everything and left her for dead. She survived, but barely. When I saw you out there, I saw her, and I thought maybe I could change how that story ended at least once." "I'm sorry," Nora said softly. "It was a long time ago. She's been gone 15 years now, but some things stay with you." He turned to look at her. "You remind me of her, not in looks but in the steel. She had that same quality, like she was built from something stronger than regular people." "I'm not strong," Nora said. "I'm just stubborn." Sometimes those are the same thing. Another silence fell, but it was charged with something new, something that made Nora's heart beat a little faster. She stood up abruptly. "I should get some sleep. Long day tomorrow." "Nora," Owen said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. She stopped. "You're braver than you give yourself credit for." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded and went inside. The next week was spent preparing for the drive to Ash Fork. Owen brought his 15 head in from his range, merging them with her recovered cattle. They organized supplies, repaired tack, and planned the route. Rust's leg was healing well, and the horse seemed eager to be back to work. They would leave in 2 days. Nora helped with all the preparations, working alongside Owen from dawn to dusk. She learned the rhythms of his ranch, the way he organized his work, the care he took with every small task. He was neat without being fussy, efficient without being harsh. She caught herself watching him sometimes, the way his hands moved when he worked with rope, or the way he spoke softly to the horses. On the evening before their departure, Owen rode into town to pick up a few final supplies. He returned near sunset and found Nora sitting on the corral fence, watching the combined herd. 41 head, she said. "That's a good number for the two of us to manage." "It is." He leaned against the fence beside her. "Nora, I need to tell you something before we leave." Her stomach tightened. Here it came. The demand, the expectation, the price for his help. "What is it?" "This drive is going to take at least 2 weeks, maybe 3 depending on conditions. We'll be spending a lot of time together, just the two of us. I want you to know that you're safe with me. I'm not expecting anything from you, and I'm not going to try anything. I just wanted to say that clearly so there's no confusion." Relief and something else, something like disappointment, flooded through her. "Thank you for saying so. But I also need to tell you that I enjoy your company. These past couple weeks have been the best I've had since my partner left. Maybe the best I've had in longer than that. You're easy to work with and you're interesting to talk to. So if after we complete this drive, you wanted to keep in touch, maybe write letters or visit, I'd like that." No pressure, just putting it out there. Nora's throat felt tight. "I'd like that too." Owen smiled and it transformed his face. "Good, that's settled then. Now let's get some dinner, I'm starving." They left at dawn 2 days later with the cattle strung out ahead of them, moving at the steady pace that would eat miles without exhausting the animals. The morning was cool, the air clear, and Nora felt something like happiness bubbling up in her chest. The first days of the drive were uneventful. They settled into a rhythm, taking turns riding point and drag, stopping to graze and water the cattle at midday, making camp in the evenings. Owen was a good teacher, showing her techniques for reading the herd's mood and anticipating problems before they developed. At night, they sat by the fire and talked. really talked in a way Nora had never experienced before. Owen asked her about her life, her childhood, her dreams. He listened to her answers with complete attention, asking follow-up questions that showed he was really hearing her. She learned about his life in return. He had grown up in Kansas, moved west after his mother's death, tried mining and freighting before settling into ranching. He read books whenever he could get his hands on them. He had opinions about politics and dreams of expanding his ranch someday, maybe running 100 head instead of just 15. On the fifth night, as they were settling into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, Owen said suddenly, "You know, you're beautiful when you talk about the things you care about. Your whole face lights up." Nora froze, her bedroll half unfolded. Don't what? Don't say things you don't mean. I know what I look like. I've lived with this face for 26 years. Owen sat up, his expression serious in the firelight. What do you think you look like? I'm plain. I've always been plain. Men don't look at me the way they look at pretty women. I learned to accept that a long time ago. Maybe you're looking for the wrong kind of attention. Owen's voice was steady. You're right that you don't look like those delicate town women with their fancy dresses and painted faces, but you look like someone real. Someone strong and capable and honest. That's a hell of a lot more beautiful than pretty. You don't have to say that. I don't have to say anything I don't mean, that's the point. He lay back down, adjusting his hat over his eyes. Think about it, Nora. Every time someone called you plain, what they were really saying is that you didn't fit into their narrow little idea of what a woman should be. But their limitations aren't your problem. You're fine exactly as you are, better than fine. Nora lay awake for a long time after he started snoring softly across the fire, turning his words over in her mind. Part of her wanted to dismiss them as kindness or pity. But Owen didn't say things he didn't mean. That was one of the first things she had learned about him. The next morning, she caught him looking at her across the herd, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. There was warmth there, and interest, and something that looked like admiration. Maybe she had been wrong about what beauty meant. The drive continued westward through New Mexico territory into Arizona. The landscape grew more dramatic, all red rock and vast skies. They passed through small settlements where Owen negotiated for supplies, and where Nora was careful to stay in the background, still wary of drawing attention. On the 10th day, they encountered their first real trouble. 3 riders approached from the south, moving with the purposeful speed of men on a mission. Owen saw them first and signaled Nora to keep the herd moving while he rode back to intercept. She watched from a distance as the 4 men talked. The conversation seemed tense. One of the strangers gestured aggressively toward the cattle. Owen shook his head, his posture relaxed but his hand resting casually near his rifle. Finally, the strangers wheeled their horses and rode off. Owen trotted back to Nora. "What was that about?" she asked. "They're working for a rancher named Collins who claims this is his range, wanted us to pay a toll to cross it. And I told them this is open range by law and we're not paying anything. They didn't like it, but they backed down. Will they be back? Maybe. We'll keep watch tonight." They made camp in a defensible position that evening with the cattle bunched tight and both of them taking turns on watch. Around midnight, Nora heard Owen moving around the camp. She sat up to find him adding wood to the fire. "Thought I heard something," he said quietly. "Probably nothing, but stay alert." They sat together by the fire, rifles across their laps, listening to the night. After an hour of silence, Owen said, "Tell me something nobody else knows about you." "Why?" "Because it's a long night and I want to know you better." Nora thought about it. "I wanted to be a teacher when I was young. I loved books and learning. But my father said education was wasted on girls, especially plain ones who would just end up married and working a farm anyway. so I never got more than basic schooling. That's a damn shame. You would have been a good teacher. How do you know? Because you're patient and smart and you explain things clearly. I've watched you with the cattle. You think through problems before acting. That's a teacher's mind. What about you? What's something nobody knows? Owen was quiet for a moment. I'm lonely. Most of the time I tell myself I prefer being alone, that I'm just independent. But the truth is I'm lonely, and I have been for years. I want a partner, someone to build something with. I want what my parents had before my father died, that sense of working towards something together. That's not shameful, Nora said. No, but it feels like failure somehow, like I should be able to be complete on my own. Nobody's complete on their own. We're built to need each other. Owen looked at her, and in the firelight his eyes were very blue and very earnest. Is that what you think we're doing here, needing each other? Nora's heart hammered. Maybe. Is that wrong? No, Owen said. It's not wrong at all. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm. They sat like that for a long time, holding hands in the firelight while the cattle breathed and shifted in the darkness beyond. Nothing attacked that night, but something had shifted between them that felt equally momentous. The next morning they rode closer together, their knees occasionally brushing. Owen started finding excuses to help her with tasks she could easily manage alone, just to be near her. Nora caught herself smiling for no reason. On the 12th day, they forded a shallow river, getting the cattle across in groups while the water swirled around the horses' legs. On the far bank, Nora's horse stumbled and she slid sideways in the saddle. Owen was there instantly, steadying her with one strong arm around her waist. "I've got you," he said, and the words seemed to mean more than just the moment. "I know," Nora said, and realized she meant it. She trusted this man completely, in a way she had never trusted anyone before. That evening they made camp near a stand of cottonwoods. After dinner, Owen walked down to the river to fill the canteens. Nora followed him, suddenly unable to bear even the small distance between them. He was kneeling by the water when she approached. He looked up, water dripping from the canteen in his hands. Nora. She couldn't find the words for what she was feeling, so she just knelt down beside him. They were face to face, so close she could see the individual sun lines around his eyes. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I'm listening. I think I'm falling in love with you. I don't know when it started, maybe that first day, maybe gradually over these weeks. But it's happened, and I needed you to know before we get to Ash Fork and go our separate ways." Owen set the canteen down carefully. "We don't have to go our separate ways. My ranch is in Texas. Yours is in New Mexico. I can sell my place, start fresh somewhere else, somewhere of our choosing." He cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the calluses. "I've been falling in love with you since I watched you stand up alone in the desert and refuse to quit. You're the strongest, most honest, most beautiful woman I've ever met, and if you'll have me, I want to spend my life with you." "I'm not pretty like other women," Nora said, the old hurt surfacing one last time. Owen smiled. "You're beautiful like no other. You're beautiful like sunrise over the desert and like good water after a long day and like every true thing I've ever seen. You're beautiful like strength and courage and stubborn hope. That's better than pretty. That's real." Nora felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "You really mean that?" "Every word." She kissed him then, leaning forward to close the small distance between them. His lips were warm and gentle, and the kiss tasted like river water and hope. His arms came around her, strong and sure, and she felt something inside her that had been clenched tight for years finally relax. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "We'll sell both our places and buy something bigger together." Build something that's ours from the ground up. Yes, Nora said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, of course, yes. They stayed by the river as the stars came out, talking about their future. Owen wanted to find land in Arizona, somewhere with good water and room to expand. Nora wanted to keep learning, maybe start a small school for ranch children who couldn't get to town. They would run cattle together, build a home together, face whatever came together. I never thought I'd have this, Nora said later, her head resting on his shoulder as they sat against a cottonwood tree. I thought I was destined to be alone, or at best to have another marriage like my first one, practical but empty. You deserve everything good, Owen said fiercely. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know that. The remaining days to Ash Fork passed in a haze of happiness. They held hands when they rode side by side. They sat close by the fire at night, talking and kissing and making plans. The cattle drive became almost secondary to the joy of being together. Ash Fork, when they finally reached it on the 15th day, was a bustling railroad town perched at the edge of high desert country. The shipping pens were busy with cattle from a dozen different ranches, and the stockyard manager was happy to take their combined herd at a fair price. Owen handled the negotiations while Nora watched, proud of his calm competence. The price he got was better than she had hoped for. With her share, she could sell her Texas ranch for whatever she could get, and still have enough capital to contribute equally to a new start. They found a small church in Ash Fork and a circuit preacher who was willing to marry them that same afternoon. Nora wore the one clean shirt she had left, and Owen bought her a handful of wildflowers from a Mexican woman selling them on the street. They stood in the small adobe church and spoke their vows with sunlight streaming through the window. When the preacher said Owen could kiss his bride, he did so thoroughly, and Nora felt beautiful for the first time in her life. They spent their wedding night in a hotel, a luxury after weeks of sleeping on the ground. Owen was gentle and patient, and when he looked at her body in the lamplight, the appreciation in his eyes was unmistakable. "You're perfect," he said, tracing the line of her collarbone. "I'm not, but I'm glad you think so." "I don't think so, I know so." The next morning they began the journey back to settle their affairs. They traveled together to Owen's ranch first, where he sorted through his possessions and made arrangements to sell the land to a neighbor who had been coveting it for years. It took a week to finalize everything, and then they rode to San Antonio. Nora's ranch looked smaller than she remembered. She walked through the house where she had lived with her late husband, and it felt like looking at someone else's life. That lonely woman seemed very far away now. She sold the property to Mr. Patterson, the banker who had tried to buy it cheap before. With Owen standing beside her, she negotiated firmly and got a fair price. Patterson looked surprised but paid without argument. Margaret Chen, the pretty girl who had called Nora plain at the funeral, saw them together on the street one afternoon. Her eyes widened with surprise, and Nora saw her whisper to her companion, a question clear in her expression. Nora just smiled and took Owen's hand, and they walked on. With their combined resources, they had enough to buy a substantial piece of land. They traveled back to Arizona and found a property an hour's ride from Flagstaff, 500 acres with a year-round creek, good grazing, and a view that stretched to the painted cliffs in the distance. They built their house together that first fall, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch and large windows to let in the light. Owen did most of the heavy construction, but Nora worked beside him, mixing mortar and hauling timber. Every nail driven was a choice they had made together. Their first winter was harsh, testing their skills and their supplies. But they faced it together, sitting by the fire on long evenings while snow piled against the windows. Owen read aloud from books they had ordered from Flagstaff, and Nora taught him the basic arithmetic she had learned, improving his ability to manage the ranch accounts. In the spring, they bought their first cattle, 50 head to start. The work was brutal but satisfying, and they were good at it together. Owen's experience and Nora's quick learning combined to make them efficient. By their first anniversary, the ranch was prospering. They had increased the herd to 75 head and had hired a young hand named Peter to help with the work. Nora had also started teaching 3 ranch children from neighboring properties twice a week, holding lessons in their kitchen. On the evening of their anniversary, Owen came in from the range to find the table set with their best dishes and a beef roast waiting. Nora had even made a cake, something she had been secretly practicing. "What's all this?" he asked, hanging up his hat. "It's been a year." "That's worth celebrating." Owen pulled her into his arms, kissing her soundly. "Best year of my life." "Mine too." Over dinner, he said, "I've been thinking. The ranch is doing well enough that we could hire another hand or two. That would free up more time for your teaching." "I know you want to expand that." Nora felt her eyes sting with happy tears. "You do that, of course. Your dreams matter just as much as mine. This is our life, our ranch. We build it together to support both of us." That night, lying in bed in the house they had built, Nora said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me. For loving me as I am. For making me believe I was beautiful." Owen rolled to face her, his hand cupping her cheek. "You are beautiful. Every day I look at you and think I'm the luckiest man alive. You're beautiful in the morning when you're grumpy before coffee. You're beautiful when you're teaching those kids and your whole face glows. You're beautiful when you're angry and when you're laughing and when you're just existing in the same space as me. You're beautiful like truth is beautiful, real and solid and lasting." Nora kissed him, pouring everything she felt into it. She had spent so many years believing she was less than other women, that her worth was diminished because her face didn't fit some arbitrary standard. But Owen had taught her a different measure. Beauty wasn't about conforming to expectations. It was about authenticity, strength, partnership, love. The years rolled forward, each one building on the last. They expanded the ranch to 200 head of cattle and bought the neighboring property when it came up for sale, doubling their acreage. Nora's teaching expanded into a proper school, and they built a small schoolhouse on their property where she taught a dozen children. Their first child came 3 years after their marriage, a son they named James. He had Nora's green eyes and Owen's steady temperament. Owen was a devoted father, carrying James on his shoulders through the ranch and teaching him about cattle and horses as soon as the boy could walk. 2 years later, a daughter arrived. They named her Ruth, and she was fierce from birth, crying lustily and demanding attention. She had Owen's blue eyes and Nora's stubborn chin. Another son came 3 years after that, Samuel, who was quiet and thoughtful, preferring books to horses. Nora saw herself in him and made sure he had access to all the learning he craved. The ranch prospered. They weathered droughts and hard winters, years when cattle prices dropped and years when they soared. Through it all, Nora and Owen worked side by side, their partnership deepening with every challenge faced and overcome. On their 10th anniversary, they threw a party for all their neighbors. The house was full of laughter and music, children running underfoot, adults sharing stories on the porch. Nora stood in her kitchen, looking out at the celebration, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Owen found her there, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Dalton." "Happy anniversary." She leaned back against his chest. "Did you ever imagine this when you found me in the desert that day?" "I imagined you were trouble," Owen said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "The best kind of trouble. I was trying to prove I didn't need rescuing. You didn't. You just needed a partner. I found the best one. Years continued to pass, measured in seasons and cattle drives and children growing and the ranch expanding. Nora's school became well known in the region, and parents brought their children from as far as 20 miles away for her teaching. Owen added a new wing to the schoolhouse to accommodate the growing numbers. James grew into a tall young man who loved the ranch and announced his intention to take it over someday. Ruth proved to be a gifted horse trainer and started a side business breeding and training cutting horses. Samuel went east to college, the first of their children to do so, studying to become a teacher like his mother. On their 20th anniversary, Nora and Owen took a trip, leaving the ranch in James's capable hands for 2 weeks. They traveled to San Antonio, retracing the route of that first cattle drive. Standing in the desert where they had met, Nora said, "It feels like a lifetime ago." It was a lifetime ago. We were different people. Do you ever regret it? Choosing this life, choosing me? Owen turned to face her, taking both her hands. At 50, his hair was streaked with silver, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but his blue gaze was as direct as ever. Regret marrying the woman I love. Regret building a life and a family with the strongest, smartest, most beautiful person I've ever known. Not for a single second, Nora. You're still the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Even with gray in my hair and wrinkles, especially with them. They're proof of life lived fully, of happiness and hard work and years together. They're beautiful because they are ours. Nora kissed him there in the desert where their story had begun, and it felt like completing a circle. They returned to the ranch to find that Ruth had sold 3 horses at excellent prices, and that Samuel had written with news that he had graduated top of his class. Life continued its forward motion, bringing new grandchildren as James married and started a family of his own, bringing new challenges as they aged and had to adjust the work to match their capacities. Through it all, Nora and Owen remained partners. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset. They still worked together, though increasingly they left the heavy lifting to younger hands. They still loved each other with the steady depth of 2 people who had built a life one choice at a time. On their 30th anniversary, the entire family gathered for a massive celebration. The ranch house rang with noise and laughter. 3 grandchildren raced through the rooms while Ruth supervised the cooking and Samuel organized games for the children. James stood with Owen, discussing ranch business and expansion plans. Nora watched it all from her rocking chair on the porch, marveling at what they had created. Not just the ranch, though that was impressive enough, but the family, the love, the home. All of it had grown from that single decision to keep going, to accept help, to take a chance on partnership. Margaret Chen, now Margaret Foster, had visited once over the years with her banker husband. She had complimented Nora's home and her children, but there had been something hollow in her eyes. Her marriage was proper and respectable, but it was clear there was no passion there, no partnership. Just 2 people living parallel lives under the same roof. Nora had felt only compassion. She understood now that pretty or plain was irrelevant. What mattered was finding someone who saw you truly and loved what they saw. As the sun set on their anniversary celebration, Owen came to sit beside her, easing his aging joints into the chair next to hers. Their grandchildren were sticky with cake and overtired, but blissfully happy. Ruth was herding them toward bed with patient efficiency. James and his wife were helping Samuel clean up the kitchen. "Quite a legacy we've built," Owen said, taking her hand as he had done thousands of times over 30 years. "We did, didn't we? You ever think about that day I found you? What would have happened if I'd ridden past? Sometimes. I probably would have died out there. or given up and settled for being someone's charity case. The world would have been poorer for it. All these people, this family, this ranch, none of it would exist. Nora squeezed his hand. But it does exist, because you stopped. Because you saw me, really saw me, and decided I was worth helping, worth loving. Easiest decision I ever made. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. James came out to join them, settling on the porch steps. "You two are legends around here, you know that," he said. "People tell stories about how you met, how you built this place from nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Owen said. "It was hope and hard work and your mother's stubborn refusal to quit." "And your faith," Nora added. "Your belief that we could do it together." James smiled. "When I marry, I want what you two have. That partnership, that respect. The way you still look at each other like you're the best thing that ever happened to one another." "You are," Owen and Nora said simultaneously, then laughed. "You're impossible," James said, but his voice was warm. More years passed, bringing the inevitable changes of aging. Owen's knees gave him trouble, and Nora's hands grew stiff with arthritis, but they adapted, finding new ways to contribute. Owen became the ranch's strategist and advisor while James handled the physical work. Nora continued teaching until her 70th birthday, when she finally retired, passing her school to a young woman from Flagstaff who had trained under her. They had been married for 42 years when Owen fell ill. It started as a cough that wouldn't clear and progressed into something more serious. The doctor came from Flagstaff and spoke in quiet, serious tones about fluid in the lungs and the limitations of medicine. Nora nursed him through that winter with fierce determination. She read to him, brought him his favorite foods, sat beside him for hours. The family took turns visiting, bringing grandchildren to cheer him up. On a cold February morning, Owen woke clear-headed and feeling better. He asked Nora to help him out to the porch. She bundled him in blankets and settled him in his chair, then sat beside him as the sun rose over their land. "It's beautiful," Owen said, his voice thin but content. "It is. I'm not afraid, you know. I've had the most incredible life. I've loved and been loved. I've built something lasting. I'm ready." Nora felt tears streaming down her face. "I'm not ready to let you go." Owen reached for her hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were bright. "You're the strongest person I know. You'll manage. You always do. Not without you. Never without me. I'll always be with you, Nora. In this land we chose together, in the children we raised, in every sunrise over these mountains. You made my life beautiful. Every single day was a gift. You made me believe I was beautiful," Nora said through her tears. "You changed everything. I just told you the truth. You are beautiful. The most beautiful thing I ever saw." He closed his eyes then, the sunrise painting his face gold. His breathing slowed, became peaceful. Nora held his hand and felt the moment he left, felt the absence of him like a physical blow. She sat there as the sun rose fully, holding the hand of the man who had saved her, loved her, built a life with her. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she sat some more, saying goodbye to her partner, her love, her other half. The funeral was huge. People came from all over Arizona to pay their respects. Owen Dalton had been respected for his fairness, his honesty, his skill with cattle and horses. But he had been loved for his kindness, his steady presence, his unwavering devotion to his family. Nora stood by his grave and felt the weight of his absence. But she also felt the presence of their children, their grandchildren, all the people whose lives had been touched by what they built together. Owen was gone, but his legacy lived on in every person gathered to mourn him. The years after Owen's death were hard. Nora missed him with an ache that never quite faded. But she continued living, because that was what they had built together, a life worth living fully. She spent time with her grandchildren, teaching them the lessons Owen had taught her about strength and partnership, and seeing the beauty in unexpected places. On what would have been their 50th anniversary, Nora rode out to the spot where they had first met. She was 81 years old, but she still sat a horse well. James had objected to the solo ride, but she had insisted. Some things needed to be done alone. She dismounted in the desert scrub and stood in the place where her life had changed. The land looked the same, eternal and indifferent. But she was different. That frightened, desperate woman who had lost her cattle and her hope seemed like someone from a story, not her own past. "Thank you," she said aloud to the empty desert, to Owen's memory, to whatever fate had brought them together. "Thank you for seeing me, for loving me." For 42 years of partnership and joy. The wind whispered through the Joshua trees, and for a moment Nora could almost feel Owen's presence, warm and steady as always. She lived another 8 years, dying peacefully in her sleep at 89. Her funeral was even larger than Owen's had been. 3 generations of Daltons gathered to mourn her, along with dozens of former students and neighbors whose lives she had touched. They buried her beside Owen on the ranch they had built, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Her headstone reads simply, "Nora Dalton, teacher, rancher, wife, mother. She was beautiful like no other." James took over as head of the family, running the ranch with the same steady competence his parents had shown. Ruth's horse breeding operation expanded into a regional reputation. Samuel became a celebrated educator, founding a school for ranch children across Arizona that carried on his mother's legacy. But more than the physical legacies, Nora and Owen had left something else. They had left the example of 2 people who found each other in the hardest of circumstances and built something beautiful through partnership and love. They had proved that beauty wasn't about conforming to standards, but about authenticity, strength, and the courage to be truly seen. Years later, when James's grandchildren asked about the family history, he would tell them the story of how their great-grandparents met. He would describe Nora standing alone in the desert, refusing to quit. He would describe Owen seeing past the surface to the strength beneath. He would tell them about the cattle drive that became a courtship, about the ranch built nail by nail, about a love that had sustained through 4 decades and beyond. "Remember," he would always finish, "beauty isn't what the world tells you it is. Beauty is truth and strength and love." Your great-grandmother taught us that. She was called plain by people who couldn't see past their own narrow definitions. But she was the most beautiful person any of us ever knew, because she was real and brave and kind. That's the kind of beauty that lasts. And the children would nod, storing the story away with all the other important truths. They would carry it forward into their own lives, this lesson about seeing truly and loving deeply, and building lives of meaning and partnership. The ranch continued for generations, each one adding to what Nora and Owen had begun. The land they chose, the house they built, the life they created together became the foundation for a family tree that spread across Arizona and beyond. And at the root of it all was a moment in the desert when a cowboy stopped to help a woman in trouble and saw something everyone else had missed. He saw beauty where others saw plain. He saw strength where others saw failure. He saw partnership where others saw only limitation. And from that seeing, everything else grew.